Hello, my name is Tuğba Tanyeri Erdemir. I'm the coordinator of ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities. Welcome to the webinar co-hosted by ADL's Task Force on Middle Eastern Minorities and FoRB Women's Alliance, titled Resisting Repression and Driving Change in the Middle East: How Women Can Lead Social Transformation. Please be aware that this call is being recorded. After we hear from our speakers, there will be an opportunity for question and answers. If you'd like to ask a question at any time during the call, simply use the Q&A function on the bottom of the Zoom program and type in your question. At this time, I would like to introduce ADL's Senior Vice President for International Affairs, Marina Rosenberg.
Thank you, Tuba, and thank you to all those joining us for this important webinar. Since its establishment in 1913, ADL has been committed to its timeless mission of stopping the defamation of the Jewish people and securing justice and fair treatment to all. Consistent with this founding vision, in 2018, ADL launched its Task Force on Middle East Minorities with a mission of educating, advocating, and elevating issues impacting often overlooked minority communities across the Middle East, including religious, ethnic, sexual, and gender minorities, and others who face governmental and societal repression and discrimination. Across the Middle East, we see repressive regimes resorting to threats, disinformation, and violence to maintain power, as they lack fair and democratic avenues for representation and governance. This is especially true in Iran, where Iranian regime has cracked down hard against women and others advocating for equality and against oppression. In these societies, women often face compound repression due to their gender and religion, often confronting discrimination, marginalization, and violence. Yet, despite this immense pressure and oppression, women are the drivers of change. And today we would like to celebrate their courage. We are proud to co-host this webinar with FoRB Women's Alliance, an accelerator for a global community of religious freedom and human rights advocates and future leaders with a shared vision, advancing freedom of religion or belief for women. Today, our expert panelists will explore the role of women and minorities in resisting and challenging repression and transforming their societies through examples from across the Middle East, including Iran, northern Syria, and Afghanistan. So without further ado, let me introduce our moderator, Judith Golub, co-founder of FoRB's Women Alliance and Director of Strategy and Planning at Religion News Foundation and Religion News Service. Judith, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marina. I am so excited to be here, and I am in awe of the energy, creativity, and indefatigability of women working for social transformation at the community, regional, and national levels. They have refused to be discouraged or pushed back by compound barriers of gender, cultural norms, economics, patriarchy, or mono-religious approaches. What they have done with the very minimum is extraordinary and demonstrates the potential about what could be achieved with more support and collaboration. This strength and resourcefulness were evident in the comments women made that form the backbone of FoRB Women's Alliance recently released Global Landscape Analysis of Women in FoRB, Women at the Table, Accelerating FoRB Capacity. You can find this report on our website, forbwomen.org. Today, we have a treat. We have an opportunity to talk with three extraordinary women with whom we will explore how women have and can lead social transformation. I'd first like to introduce Nadine Maenza. Nadine is president of the USCIRF Secretariat, a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and former chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Next, I'd like to introduce Marjan Keypour. She's co-chair of ADL's task force and is the founder and director of the Alliance for Rights of All Minorities, ARAM, an international network of advocates that promotes human rights in Iran. She is also a non-resident fellow Scholar with the Middle East Institute's ARAM program. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Farahnaz Ispahani. She's a fellow co-founder with me of FoRB Women's Alliance, along with Louane Sabatier. She also is a senior fellow at the Religious Freedom Institute and a former Pakistani parliamentarian. Her most recent book is Politics of Hate, Religious Majoritarianism in South Asia. So we'd like to start with Nadine. Nadine, could you please give us your opening remarks?
Thanks so much. And first I want to say thanks to the Anti-Defamation League's Task Force on Middle East Minorities and the FoRB Women's Alliance for co-hosting this important event and letting me be a part. And of course, so I'm amazed by my distinguished professionals as panelists. I've had the opportunity to see firsthand how women could be major drivers in changing their society. And one of the most impressive examples I've seen is the women of Northeast Syria. To put it in context, in March 2004, a riot developed during a championship soccer match in Qamishli in Northeast Syria between a Kurdish team and an Arab team from Deir ez-Zor, killing 9 Kurdish youth. And the harsh government protest response to this really started protests around the country and even abroad. So afterwards, most of the country would go back to the status quo until 2011, when protests would begin again. That would start the civil war. But in the Northeast, it marked a significant shift. The Kurdish community began political organizing and creating militias, and women played a major role in both of those. And Syrian women were also a part of building political organizations at the same time. And so while it was outlawed, any sort of organizations like this, it was all underground, it was door to door, it was educating people one-on-one. It was about changing the ideas of dignity and the equality of all people, regardless of gender, ethnicity, or race. In fact, the Kurdish phrase "women like freedom" was used in the early 2000s in this region. And so in the women, particularly in Turkey and in Syria. So when the civil war started in 2011, the Northeast was ready after years of organizing. And, you know, they in 2012 moved into government buildings and militias shut down the roads, and they ended up pushing out the regime that was too preoccupied with fighting the Syrian opposition in the major cities. And of course, most people weren't aware of the people of Northeast Syria and what they were doing until they partnered with the US to defeat ISIS, first starting in Kobani in 2015. But what was remarkable is how they liberated areas, the Arab areas from ISIS, as they'd empower self-organizing to begin in those areas that also had women taking leadership roles and transforming their societies to be advocates for religious freedom, because they combined this ethnicity, religion, gender. It didn't matter. All of those, no matter which one you had, you deserved the same dignity. And that part of their ideology was a powerful change maker in the fact that women were the key to that. I was in Tapka in March, and the women, I was asking them about how they did this. They talked about how after ISIS was defeated, they started checking on the women in their society, and they started going door to door. And they didn't use the word war room, but they really warmed their community. And when they found a house that had problems, they would go to the husbands, they'd go to the husband's friends, they'd go to the imam, and they'd bring people together, and so that they could change their society, literally family by family, door by door. And, you know, I want to mention too that, you know, the women in the regime areas, you know, have been leaders. We've seen women in Iraq and the Yazidi communities become leaders. We've seen leaders women step in the Middle East to pick up the pieces of failed policies all over. So, you know, just give me a little piece in the limited time I have to talk particularly about the women of North, especially the Kurdish women that inspired this movement, but really how all the different women in these different ethnicities have come alongside and really created a fascinating transformational change that we should learn more about. So I'm so looking forward to hearing from my panelists and having a discussion about this. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nadine. We could spend our whole hour right on that, but let's turn now to Farahnaz. Farahnaz?
Hi, Judy. Many thanks to the ADL task force, to my colleague and friend Marjan, the current co-chair, Marina, and to you all for this really important gathering. And I think, why is this gathering important? Because we're talking about women, not as women as collateral damage, not as women as peripheral to, but we're talking today about women, and specifically women in the Middle East. And in, I will be speaking about the Taliban and ISIS Khorasan and the Hazara Shia community, particularly the women in Afghanistan and Pakistan today. Now, why is this so important to me? Because even in the FoRB community, and Judy, you know this as well as I do, women are trotted out to tell their terrible stories of what's happened to them on the ground, and then they disappear. No, women are central to the story of what is happening to religious minorities everywhere. Women from religious minority groups are the most vulnerable. They are the smallest numerically, and they are the people who need our help, our voices, our work on the ground, and are taking our work to governments wherever we are. So this is what I have called and written about as the double persecution. Religious minorities all over in most of the Middle East today, and in many Muslim majority countries, where most minorities, especially of the Abrahamic faiths, Jews and Christians, have been wiped out. But the women are affected differently. Going way back to when I worked on ISIS, when ISIS actually existed, the women faced something different to the men who were killed in battle by ISIS, who were enslaved. What was the difference? The brutality suffered by women to themselves, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional and psychological abuse that was suffered by Yazidi women, Christian women, and Shia Muslim women. Why? Because they were all seen as being kafirs, and therefore they could be enslaved, they could be raped, they could be impregnated. And to this day, these women, who very few people talk about anymore, are still suffering from psychological impacts. And some have babies, so they're not welcome back, for example, within the Yazidi communities, and they're living away from their communities even today because they don't want to give up their children. This is a very deep issue. Women in Iran today at the front lines, being shot in the eyes, being imprisoned, and I know Marjan will speak about this in a way that I cannot, being a born Iranian, being a woman from a minority group in Iran. So today, basically, my talk, I'm going to finish up now, and I'm just going to say, I'm going to talk about two things. The book I've just written, which focuses on majoritarianism. What is majoritarianism? How does it affect religious minority communities? And how does it affect women differently? So that is what I have to say, and my focus will be on the Hazara women of Afghanistan and Pakistan, who are not just a religious minority, but also an ethnic minority. So their troubles are quadrupled in some ways: their gender, their ethnic identity, their religious beliefs, and their minority status. Thank you all for having me here today. And I look forward to hearing Marjan's remarks now.
Thank you so much, Farah. Again, we could spend hours on that. I'd like to turn to Marjan now. Marjan, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to thank everyone behind the scene at ADL who's making sure that we have a smooth conversation. I also want to send my thanks and greetings to the co-panelists joining us today. I am a fan of each one of them, and it's really an honor and privilege to be here with you. Before I start, I want to encourage everyone to buy and read Farahnaz's book, Politics of Hate, fresh off the press. And it really encapsulates everything that we are discussing in many ways. But today I want to focus my attention on what is happening in Iran. And yes, as Farahnaz mentioned, I was born and raised both a woman and a minority in Iran. And I, as an activist in human rights issues, I do have the opportunity to follow up on what is going on in the country. And I can tell you that since the Islamic Revolution in '79 and the overall fall of women to second-class citizens, women have been fighting to regain their basic rights and their basic dignities, from equal treatment before the law, reproductive rights, fairness in divorce and child custody cases, countering child marriage and forced marriage, men's polygamy, right to self-determination in seeking an education or employment, protection against gender-based violence, and of course, the right to have agency over their own body and their own clothing, including hijab. And since the murder of Mahsa Amini last September, this fight really took over the entire country like a tsunami, and also had reverberations in the international community. And it really awoke the rest of the world to the atrocities that the Iranian women were experiencing, but also to the repression that is practiced against the entire population. But today in Iran, women are both at the center of the regime's repression and also the engine for a revolution against it. Women have continued their acts of civil disobedience, not just by protesting in the streets and facing the consequences, but also by walking in the streets without the mandatory Islamic garb, despite the risk of arrest, imprisonment, torture, sexual abuse, and so on. They are posting pictures of themselves without the hijab in those streets, not as acts of vanity, but as an act of immense bravery, knowing that the myriad of cameras that are monitoring the street corners could capture their images, and the sophisticated AI technology of the country could recognize them and identify them, sending them a message on their cell phones and summon them to show up to court and catch them in an endless web of criminal procedures. But like women, Iran's religious minorities have also been experiencing repression for their beliefs. And despite their religious adherences, they have been forced also to practice the mandatory hijab for the women. And we know that the regime that controls women really controls everything, including thoughts. Just earlier this week, two men named Youssef Mehrdad and Sodarullah Fazeli-Zareh were executed on blasphemy charges for insulting their Islam. And indeed, the Islamic Republic is obsessive with enforcement of both the hijab and also individuals' ideologies. While poverty is raging in the country, and the country is reeling with crime, corruption, violence, addiction, and many other social problems, the regime seems to be uniquely preoccupied with enforcing the hijab and monitoring people's thoughts. And in the meanwhile, murderers, thieves, and white-collar criminals are getting away. So based on my analysis, this selective enforcement is practiced because it's really about asserting the regime's authority and its forced intent to maintain power and control over the society. especially now because its legitimacy is challenged more than ever before. So let's remember in final that the fight today, the movement inside Iran today, is not just about the hijab. It's about the dignity for all human beings and all the people in the country. Hijab is just a simple symbol of this repression. And the revolution is about challenging this repressive system in its entirety.
Thank you, Marjan. Again, we could spend hours talking about what you raise. And thank you, three of you, for making some really insightful comments focusing on women, victims of profound and compound persecution, but also women as engine for change. I'd like to explore a lot of these issues a little bit more by asking some questions. I'd like to start with Farahnaz. Farahnaz, you mentioned your book on religious, and so did Marjan, religious majoritarianism. Can you explain what it is and how majoritarianism particularly affects women of religious and ethnic minorities? Thanks, Farahnaz.
Thank you so much, Judy. So the reason why I wanted to write about this and also to talk about this a little bit today is because, you know, I think it's at the crux of all of the things that all of us are making points about. I'll just briefly explain the concept of majoritarianism and then explain my focus on this issue that is crucial to religious minorities around the globe, including the Middle East, and then tie that to the Hazaras, a religious and ethnic minority in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Majoritarianism is defined as the idea that pre-existing ethnic, racial, or religious majorities have a natural right to dominate a certain political entity. In India, that means the Hindus. In Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, the concept requires dominance of Muslims. And in Sri Lanka, for example, Buddhists can lay claim to majoritarian preeminence. But in each of these countries, various religious minorities have coexisted alongside the majority for years. The majoritarian trend undermines that coexistence. In each case where a majority asserts an inherent right to dominate, its narrative portrays the minority as a threat either to the beliefs or the way of life of the majority. In some cases, the minority is labeled as being tied to a country's real or perceived enemies. You know, for example, the US, Israel, etc. Majoritarianism is often sustained by conspiracy theories and fear. It usually takes only one populist movement to set the majority against minorities. Majoritarianism plays on otherization of the minority, and if history is any guide, seldom enhances stability or peace in a society. The two, I would say, three most glaring examples of majoritarianism in the last century would be Hitler's Germany and the depths of hatred and inhumanity towards the Jewish people and other people. And the other two examples, one is the example of a non-state actor, ISIS, which along with the barbarity that's displayed in daily life and in battle, enslaved and physically and sexually brutalized Christian Yazidi and Shia women as being non-Muslims and kafirs, and therefore in their eyes, less than human. And the third example, and a very gripping example today, because of the topic today of women being the change makers, women standing up, women of the majorities and the minorities, we see Iran. Iran, in a way, is a shining light of the power of the human and of women. And women of the majority and minority communities coming out in the streets, and with young men and people of all ages and stages and all faiths and ethnicities standing with them. So today I will be later focusing on the Hazaras, who are an ethnic group predominantly based in Afghanistan, but with a sizable number in Pakistan. Hazaras are the majority are Shias, but they are Sunni Hazaras as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. So Farah, your comments lead me to ask Marjan this question. What can we do to be better allies for the women in Iran who are driving change now?
Thank you. I really love this question, and I really appreciate it when people outside of Iran want to be supportive, because what that means is that they have there's finally an understanding of the suffering that is taking place in the country, and there is a sense of humanity and symbiosis that is taking place. So at this particular moment, there are different ways that we can support them. One is to continue to be aware of what is taking place. Something that I always say is when you see an article about human rights issues in Iran, click on it, because when you click on it, you're letting the editors know that there is interest in the topic, and there will be a continuity of the coverage of human rights issues in Iran, and that is incredibly important. Second of all, I think that through social media, you can continue the grassroots activists who are trying to shed light on what is going on in the country. And with that, we have to support access to internet freedom and communication solutions in the country. Then there are also some opportunities to engage your local politicians in supporting the people of Iran. One is to hold the Iranian regime accountable for their crimes against their own civilians. There are many ways to do that. One option right now that is very important to bring to the forefront is the Mahsa Amini Act. It is HR 589. It's a bipartisan act that is going to be voted on, and I really encourage everyone to read the summary of this act and support it, because most importantly, it holds the top leaders of the regime accountable, and will, for the first time, sanction the people who are at the helm of the Islamic Republic for the crimes that they are eliciting against the citizens. But also it provides a myriad of other supports for the Iranian people, and I think it is important to do that. When you see protests taking place inside, in the streets of the US or wherever you live in support of the Iranian population, please participate or ask questions, ask your Iranian friends about what is going on. And then lastly, again, it is very important that we understand that lifting sanctions from perpetrators of human rights crimes does not help the Iranian economy, does not take the Iranian population out of poverty. And that, yes, while we should provide humanitarian support for people of Iran, I think that it is important that we also punish, that there will be a consequence for the perpetrators of those violations through both isolation, diplomatic isolation, and also economic sanctions.
Thank you, Marjan. Marjan, you talked about awareness, and I want to turn now to Nadine. In addition to Northeast Syria, where are there other bright spots, and what can we learn from these bright spots?
Yeah, that's really a passion of mine is, so much of the time in religious freedom, we spend so much time talking about the problem areas that we're not learning from the areas that have success. And to me, that's one of the missing pieces. I'd love for academia and researchers and activists to do some deep dives in a lot of different places so we can better understand. Certainly one that comes to mind that I've been working in and been able to visit recently and going back again in a few months is Taiwan. I mean, how does a Mandarin speaking island that has been conquered by the Dutch, Japanese, Chinese end up with this vibrant democracy with remarkable religious freedom conditions? They have a female president and a female ambassador in the United States. And women have played leadership roles, throughout their history. In another place I'd love for people to understand better, and also, we need to learn from communities that have recovered from wars and conflict to build these peaceful societies. When you look at places like Northern Ireland, there have been articles written about the women transforming and healing those communities. South Africa is the same. And then by contrast, I've met with government officials from governments that are earnestly trying to improve their religious freedom conditions. And they'll bring a whole group of people to brainstorm how to better do that. And you look around the table and it's almost always all men. And so I think that there's this missing, the women, when they're not at the table, it's just not going to get done. And so as we've seen in places like Iran and others where they're inspiring change, and once they're able to be in a government position, they'll be able to move change further. But we have to think about how to encourage civil society, government officials, U.S. government policy to better support women in these roles, because that's where we're going to see that long-term change. And also we're going to see the next generation come along with them, which I think is another crucial piece to all of this, as so much of the world is growing in population, and the women are going to have a big say in the kind of leaders we're going to come out of that, those generations.
Thank you. Such rich responses we could talk about forever, but I'd like you now to turn a little bit, and I'd like you all to tell us what we really need to know after we leave here. What do all of us need to know from you? I'd like to start with Marjan on that.
So I think what is important to keep in mind is that there has been after 8 months of protests in the streets of Iran, I think that the level of progress in the civil society from the Western perspective has become the level of participation in the streets. And I want to emphasize here that while the street protest participation is one measure of civil society activism, it is not the only way that it should be measured. Both in terms of fighting gender-based persecutions, as well as the systemic persecutions that are taking place in Iran, there are many engines of resistance that are in motion at any given time in the country. And we should not just look at it from the perspective of protests on the streets. And, I mentioned that, women walking out without the hijab and taking pictures of themselves is one form, but the dissatisfaction and the cries for help are expressed in many different formats within the strict confines of Iran's controlling system that really gives very little leeway for self-expression. And we have to look at the strikes that are taking place, the economic boycotts. We have to look at the fact that despite the poisonings in the schools of Iran, girls are still going to school, that they're still trying to resist and live another day. It is itself an act of bravery and courage and an act of resistance, that we are not going to be scared of your repressive tactics, that we still value education and empowerment, and we're going to fight, even if that means that we're going to get poisoned and hospitalized as a result of it. Girls who have, women and girls, as well as all of the political prisoners who have come out of the horrifying conditions of Iranian prisons and have told their accounts of what they endured and what they witnessed either on their own bodies or their cellmates. Those stories should be read, even though they're incredibly difficult to read and to hear. We cannot turn a blind eye. And when they're going out to share these experiences, again, despite all of the filters and all of the repressive systems, it's important to give them the respect of knowing about them. That only will make us better allies. And also it will strengthen the case for policies that, such as this Mahsa Amini Act that will be presented, that will be voted on in Congress. Number one is don't get fixated on one practice of civil disobedience. There are many other ways. Something else is that there will be others who will culturally explain or attempt to culturally explain what is happening in Iran. And they will tell you that this is part of the Iranian culture, that modesty is part of our culture, or certain kind of marriage is part of our culture, and they don't want to be insulting the religious beliefs or the ideological beliefs of the region. Therefore, they feel like objecting and criticizing it would be rude or disrespectful to the cultures. And I want to emphasize that a culture that requires violence for its enforcement is not culture, it's oppression. And if hijab were really to be a part of the majority of Iranian women's culture, it would not have been needed to be enforced with bullets and bludgeons. Put away that notion, because it does not come from sensitivity to the culture, to region's culture. Rather, it comes from ignorance and insensitivity, and don't fall for that. I'll pause here.
Thank you, Marjan, for focusing on the many forms of resistance and the way to look at Iranian culture. I'd now like to turn to Nadine. Nadine, what do we need to know? Thank you.
I think it's important in how that we don't put women empowerment into a Western frame as we present it in the Middle East. As I'm, meeting with, like, for instance, a lot of the Kurdish women, some of them still wear hijabs in the Northeast, some of them don't. In the Arab communities, they tend to almost all wear them, but it's not a legal, of course, requirement. And as I was talking to the Arab women in particular, that still have a pretty conservative religious community, and talk about how before ISIS, they couldn't leave their houses without a guardian. Then ISIS came and showed them this wasn't what our religion believed, and was really a pressure cooker in a lot of ways for them and their families. And then when ISIS left and they started the self-governance, where they had a role, where some of the women told me they never had gone out without a guardian. Here they are, a government leader now that meets with men all the time, and goes in office during the days, but then comes back home again. And they still have maintained their religious community, their family life. It wasn't like throwing the baby out with the bathwater by empowering women to be leaders in their own society. Instead, it actually created an environment that benefited the men and the women and the families. And it was one woman told me, like, I now am strong, but I don't boss around my husband. It's not like that. We're now equals. And so I just think we have to really follow the lead of the people on the ground. And I think we were just hearing about the hijabs in Iran is the people on the ground need to create the communities that will benefit them and their families. And we should come alongside them and support them the best we can, and be especially sensitive to those cultural sensitivities of each of these areas. It's the most respectful thing we can do.
Thank you for focusing on listening to women on the ground. I'd like to turn to Farahnaz. Farahnaz, what do we need to know?
Firstly, I'd just like to say that the return of Afghanistan to Taliban rule has been disastrous for human rights, but it has been disastrous for the women and girls, especially those from the minority communities like the Hazaras. The Taliban were the main persecutors of the Hazaras during the 90s. Now they've been joined in the persecution of the Hazaras by ISIS-K, or the Islamic State of Khorasan. And what we have seen in spring 2020, for example, armed men attacked the Doctors Without Borders maternity wing in the Dasteh-Baji hospital, killing 24 people. Among the dead were 16 mothers, a midwife, and 2 young children. According to a September 2022 report by Human Rights Watch, since the Taliban took power in Afghanistan, the Islamic State affiliate has claimed responsibility for 13 attacks against Hazaras and has been linked to at least 3 more, killing and injuring at least 700 people. And in Pakistan, the numbers are equally bad every year. In September 2022, an Islamic State attack killed 50 mostly teenage girls at a private tutoring center in a Hazara neighborhood in Western Kabul. This led to protests by Hazara women demanding better security from the Taliban-run government. In the letter that they wrote, they said, "We're asking the Taliban government, when they claim that they brought security, how they cannot stop an attacker from entering an educational center to target female students. In this incident, one family has lost 4 members. Why is this still happening?" Now, how are the Hazara women resisting in spite of this onslaught from ISIS-K now and the Taliban? And what can we do for them? Women all over the Middle East and Asia fight for their families' rights to live in peace and with dignity. They protest for themselves, but also others. Women today all over Asia are showing great courage under sometimes brutal regimes. But when women who belong to the most numerically weak and vulnerable religious and ethnic minority groups stand up to speak, there's a sense of hope and change. A deadly attack on students preparing for exams in a packed hall in Kabul killed more than 50 people and left scores more injured. And this attack led to a wave of protests by young female students across several provinces. The protests chanted slogans: security is our right, education is our right, stop genocide. On social media, the Twitter hashtag Stop Hazara Genocide garnered more than 1 million shares. And we have seen in Mazar-e-Sharif, female university students protesting the Taliban. We have seen videos on social media about the Taliban locking, beating, and bringing a lot of force on the Hazara women and other Afghan women protesting also. But what should we do? What can we do to help? Well, I think one of the very big things that has happened today is that it's spreading. And I don't think it's like the Arab Spring, which, I saw a little bit of firsthand. You see today in Iran, in bordering Afghanistan, in areas of Pakistan, many places in the Middle East today, women from majority and minority communities marching together, and the Iranian expression of Zan Zindagi Azadi, Women, Life, Freedom, is something that the Kurdish people have used, Kurdish women have used, and the Afghan and Hazara women have come up with similar phrases that have caught on. They have figured out how to use social media. So when we are speaking for example, the Mahsa Amini Act, let's not forget the women in the neighboring countries, because we have the ability to do something much bigger right now. We have the ability, they're standing for the change. They're standing for it physically. They're engaging their lives. All of us here can help, put in a sidebar, put in an amendment, make sure that all the women of the region are heard, because they're braver and more courageous than anything we can imagine. And those from minority groups, we have to be their voices today more than ever. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Farah. Important reminder that you gave us. Now we can open up to questions, and I see some questions in the chat. I'd like to ask one question too, and I think all three of you can address it, but I'd like to start with Nadine. How can US policy help empower women in other countries? And I'm going to amend that a little bit to say, how can US policy and US civil society help empower women in other countries? Nadine, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's an endless amount of ways that we can do that, of course, but I think that making sure women have that seat at the table. I mean, if you know, the US government has a project in a country, or you know, and the only people at the table are the men, they can say, I don't think so, you know. And so from a diplomatic standpoint, it could be closed that way. USAID, in terms of funding projects, you know, can make sure that women are included in this. But I also think we need to do a deep dive in better learning, to be sensitive to the cultural environments in each of these places, and make sure that people like the women that are alongside me can be advising the US government as they're going in and doing some of these things, rather than a bunch of men in a room come up with a policy to empower women that can have the opposite effect, frankly. It could really not be helpful if a bunch of men come in and say, we need women here. You know, I think we need to be sensitive to how, in a cultural appropriate way in each of these communities, that the local people on the ground, the women there, their leaders like we have here, that understand what's happening, are guiding the US government, are guiding the UK government, are guiding people coming in, big NGOs investing, that they're listening to people on the ground that know how to improve it, so women have a say in what's happening in a long-term way. This isn't about having them in one meeting. This is about changing the way that women are looked at, so that they can be the part, not just part of it, but really, because we know once they're a part of it, there'll be those catalysts for change. And I think what I see now is they're either included, kind of like, oh, we need a woman, let's just get a woman here, or they're not included. So how do we do it where it's actually effectively, and it's going to transform their society, so women will have that seat, a real seat at the table?
Thank you, Nadine. Farah or Marjan, do you want to talk about how can US policy and civil society help empower women in other countries?
Can I just, jump in on this, because I want to, you know, Nadine, I agree with you about being culturally sensitive, but as someone who as a child spent a lot of time in Iran before the revolution, I saw a different Iran. So are we being culturally sensitive to women who are being forced to wear the hijab, who are being forced to take a back seat in education, who are being forced? You see, this is a manufactured way that authoritarian governments find different ways to assert control. So we have to think about, what does culturally sensitive mean? The other thing that I want to say is, I don't think these women who are facing brutality in prisons and during marches, and Hazara women who from their features look different to other Afghans, you know, the way they're being brutalized, they don't need us to teach them how to stand up. They need us to be their voice in the West, in the Middle East, where I am right now, wherever we all are, to speak to the leadership, to make sure that the women are at parity with any conversation on peace and security, education, social welfare, all of those things. I think, to me, that's the better way, because very often, you know, we've seen billions of dollars of US aid coming to Pakistan to help women. And most of the trainers came from places like DC and were trying to teach things to women who were already, I would say,
well seasoned on those things. That's not, no, that's you're making the point I was trying to make
I'm not
far more
disagreeing with
eloquently.
you. I'm just giving my own perspective.
Yeah.
That's all.
I agree with you.
I will add to this. I think there is a genuine lack of understanding of the region that is taking place at the highest levels of the government. And I think that whatever gets more press gets more attention. And if it's not getting press, then it doesn't become a policy. And really for us human rights activists, to just get into the narrative of the media was really a struggle. And now finally there's some attention, but even at this moment, when everybody knows, after hundreds of lives that have been lost, after at least dozens of other women since September have had the same fate as Mahsa Amini, still there's no real policy that we can refer to to say that anything has changed regarding policy regarding Iran. So I think that comes from both fear of the region and probably deeper than that, lack of understanding of the region, and an unwillingness to look at it to look at different scenarios, to see what could actually be different. Should we go back to the same old policies over and over and see if things are working, or just trying something new and engaging with people in the streets, with the grassroots to the extent that it is possible, like Nadine said. And I know it's incredibly difficult, but they really want to be heard. One of the demands of activists, one of the ways that we echo the needs of the civil society in Iran is that if you can't do anything to our favor, okay, let's let that be, but at least don't do anything to the favor of our repressors. Do not support our repressors, even if you don't know how to help us. And that's why, again, this whole issue of legitimizing the government entity, through policies and diplomacies and economic engagement is so important, because they are trying to have their own revolution. They're trying to create their own change from inside, despite all of the challenges. But in America and in Europe, they're still thinking about, well, what should we do about the nuclear policy? What should we do about economic policy? And they're going back to the same old. The other last thing I want to say about this is that there has been a double standard in treating human rights violations in the region. Again, like everybody knows about what is wrong in Saudi Arabia, but very rarely until recently did we hear about human rights violations in Iran. And if you just do a Google search, which from the last 5 years covering human rights issues in Saudi Arabia versus covering human rights issues in Iran, I would say predominantly that Saudi Arabia would have a lot more coverage than Iran. I think human rights violations should be condemned wherever they happen. but it should be done without preferential treatment to any regimes.
So that leads me, Marjan, to another question that goes to that. What has been the reaction of other countries and feminists around the world, especially in Iran?
I can tell you that in the beginning of the Mahsa Amini revolution, there was hesitancy about commenting because, again, a lot of the feminists were, did not want to be disrespectful of the culture, and they didn't know how to cover, how to be allies. And it wasn't until there were robust statements from America's first ladies and big icons of feminism. Later on, I think it came in October, that finally it became, it received the stamp of approval. But in terms of the reaction at the moment, I can tell you that there is not enough of expression and continuity of coverage. And again, the reason why I brought up the pitfall of measuring the civil society movement through the revolution, through the street protests, is because I am afraid that when the protests are not taking place in the streets and people are not literally getting shot in the eye, the reporters feel like there's nothing to cover. And therefore it is out of sight, out of mind of the feminist activists as well. So we have to really dive deeper into what is the day-to-day experiences of women and girls, and as well as the lives of Iran's ethnic and religious minorities, and not get caught up in the personality fights that are now capturing the headlines about, who is a better representative of the movement here, or what's going to happen after the regime falls. Iran is going to become Assyria, Iran is going to become Iraq. Like those conversations are starting to take place of the narrative, but I think we should really continue to talk about how Iran is Syria right now, how Iran is like Iraq right now, and what should be done about it right now before it becomes worse.
And finally, looking at the geopolitical situation right now with Saudi Arabia and Iran being brought together by China, the United States did not react when the people of Iran stood up during the Green Revolution and said, we have stood up, help us. We didn't help them. They were all killed, tortured, never seen again. We can't have that moment happening again for Iran. We allowed the Taliban back into Afghanistan, and now they're doing the same things to women, they're doing the same things to minorities. And so in a way, or how we look at foreign policy is foreign policy and human rights work together. And if the US has been taking its eye off the ball, those of us, whether through organizations like ADL, for example, or other organizations, our own organizations, etc., we have to be, this is the moment to be, for me to be supporting Marjan, for Marjan to be supporting me, for me to be supporting Nadine. This is that moment, because, this moment may pass again, which is why I brought up the Green Revolution. And what's happening, the final thing is America has left Israel in this neighborhood with the UAE and certain partners holding the bag of this Saudi-Iranian relationship, which cannot be good for the human rights issues that we have been talking about today. So it's a serious time. It's a very serious time, and these are very serious topics, and I hope we can all work together.
Thank you. Thank you for this very rich conversation. Unfortunately, the hour has passed. I want to thank you all so much for a very, very rich conversation and helping us to begin to understand the essential roles that women play in social transformation and what the kind of issues we need to be sensitive to. So thank you again. I'd like to turn it back to Tuba. Thank you.
At this time, our briefing is finished. We'd like to thank all our presenters. Please stay tuned for updates from ADL, from ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities, and from FoRB Women's Alliance. Thank you for joining us and have a great day.